Yes.
Okay, today we're speaking to Judge David S. Cercone. And tell me a little bit about growing up in Stowe.
I would say I had an extraordinary childhood as far as that's concerned, in this sense. I grew up on a plateau in Stowe Township overlooking the city of Pittsburgh. You could see the three rivers coming together right at the point. And the focal point was a large field, a playground, actually part of the Stowe Township School District, later Stowe Rocks. But it was several acres, and remember, this is the height of the baby boom era, so there were just dozens and dozens of kids. And I refer to it as a kid's utopia, because we would, there were so many kids, and we would have sports going on, baseball in the spring, in the summer, football in the fall, basketball, just not organized sports so much, games that we picked up, but it was just wonderful. And the parents were, for the most part, blue collar. We were close to Neville Island, which is an industrial area, and a lot of my friends' parents worked down on Neville Island, Draveau, Shenango, Neville Chemical, Marquette Cement, and that's where most of the parents did work.
Was your family very connected with the community?
The Cercone Musmano family, that was my dad's side of the family, went back, for 100 years into Stowe, and they held elected offices on the local level. They were involved very much in PTA and things of that nature. But I did want to mention one other thing about growing up there. But it wasn't all sports, although it was a big part of it. I grew up right next door to Chuck Fusina, who was the runner-up for the Heisman Trophy. Okay, and we had other talented athletes, Tom Clemens, who was a professional football player, and so on. But one of my law clerks is Jim Catanzarite, who was part of this group. We grew up together, and he recalls my debating John Kasich, who was my dear friend, who was served in Congress and was a two-term governor of Ohio, debating the presidential election of 1968 at the bus stop as we're waiting for the bus to go to school. I was for Hubert Humphrey, and John Kasich was for Richard Nixon. But so it wasn't just sports. We talked about current events.
What drew you to the law originally? Did you know fairly early in life that this was something you were going to do?
Well, my family was involved in the law to an extent. I had two uncles, a granduncle and an uncle who both were judges. That was Justice Michael Amos Mano, who served on the Pennsylvania Supreme Court and also was a judge at Nuremberg. And my uncle, Judge William Cercone, who served for many years on the Common Pleas Court of Allegheny County and also was on the Pennsylvania Superior Court. So certainly when you're a young boy and you're sitting around the dining room table on a Sunday afternoon and you're listening to Michael A. Musmano talk about his experience as a judge at Nuremberg and his conversations with Sacco and Vanzetti, whom he represented in the appellate stages of their case. And to hear Uncle Bill, William Cercone, talk about his career, it certainly has to have an influence on you. But I think the decision really came when I was a senior in high school. And I had a serious conversation with my piano teacher. And he asked me what my plans were. I studied with Carmen Rumo, who was a well-known piano teacher in Pittsburgh area. As a matter of fact, at some point in his life, the city council in Pittsburgh named a Carmen Rumo Day after him. And he was a professor at Duquesne Music School. And he asked me, as I was about to go to college, what I was going to major in. And I told him, I narrowed it down to 3 areas: pre-law, education, or music. And he told me very frankly, you should be a lawyer. He was subtly telling me, don't go into music. It just wasn't there. It was, it was a great love of mine, but as far as professionally, it just wasn't meant to be.
I must ask you before we move on, if any of those stories your uncle told you about Nuremberg or representing Cercone and Vanzetti shaped your view of law or justice or anything of that kind. Were there any stories you recall that were particularly meaningful?
Well, I do remember him talking about the death penalty. And I remember something that he said that has stuck with me. And what he said was that he was opposed to the death penalty, even though he had imposed it at Nuremberg. He felt that the crimes committed were so atrocious that the death penalty was warranted. But he said to me once, or to the family as we were talking about it, he said the thing that bothered him most was the fact that juries are not infallible. And what do you do if you have a case where someone was innocent, as Cercone and Vanzetti were? I'm sure that affected him. These men that he came to represent and to really respect, and I think he really had quite a love for these 2 poor immigrants, a fisherman and a shoemaker. And he was convinced that they were wrongly convicted and executed. So I just remember him strongly being against the death penalty in that sense. And he was ahead of his time, because we are seeing so many cases where DNA evidence is showing that individuals were innocent.
Your undergraduate years were at Westminster College.
Yes.
Which I've been to, and it's a beautiful campus.
It is.
In a beautiful little town of New Wilmington. How did you happen to go there, and was that important to you to go to a school like that?
Yeah, I was a teacher of mine in high school, had gone there, and he recommended it. Yes, I did not want a large university. I wanted a smaller school. I wanted to go away to school, but wanted to be close enough home that in case I wanted to come home for a hot meal or bring some laundry home for Mom, I could do that. It's only about 60 miles away. And since I was planning pre-law, I wanted a liberal arts school, and it seemed to have all of the criteria that I was looking for. And as you mentioned, the campus was beautiful. I think I fell in love with the campus, and that was as big a factor as any.
Now, your law education was at Duquesne.
Yes.
Were there particular people or courses that really shaped you and were memorable for you there?
I loved constitutional law and evidence. As far as people's concerned, my favorite, although she did hold the title of a full professor, but she was actually the law librarian, Elizabeth Scheib. And I was one of her library aides. And she sort of took a liking to me. I don't know why, but she did, and she actually helped me get the small little paycheck every 2 weeks for some extra time I put in. That was a big help at that time. You're a law student and you're not working. But yeah, I really admired her, and if I had any problems or any issues, I would talk to Betty Scheib.
That's a good story. And while you were there, did you sort of narrow your focus of what sort of law that you wanted to go into?
I know that I did not want to work for a large firm. It's kind of ironic because my son's a lawyer, and that's exactly what he wanted to do and is doing. He's with one of the largest firms in the world. That never interested me because I did have this interest in politics and the judiciary. So that's I wanted to go in that direction.
Did the interest in politics and the judiciary have to do with a desire to affect society in some way, to do good, or was there other reasons why you might have been drawn to that?
I think so. Growing up, a dream job for me was to be a district attorney. I'm going to give you an anecdote on that. When I was making my holy confirmation in the Catholic Church, if you might know, or maybe you don't, the bishop officiates. And at that time, the Bishop of Pittsburgh was John Wright, later Cardinal Wright. And in preparation for our confirmation, the nuns were going to put on a little program where the students were going to be put in teams, and we were going to ask the other team questions about our catechetics. And I was the captain of my team. So my job was to ask the other team some questions about their catechism. And when I was done, Bishop Wright said, "That young man's going to be district attorney someday," the way he was firing those questions. And I thought to myself, would it be possible that someday I could be district attorney or an assistant district attorney? And I remembered that. I was 10 years old. That was 1962. And that stuck with me. And I always wanted to be in the district attorney's office. And when I was hired, that was just one of the greatest days of my life. I was so happy.
In looking at your chronology, did you go right from graduation to being a law clerk with Judge Zavarella?
Graduated from law school, studied that summer, took the bar in July, and got the results in November, and I started shortly thereafter with Judge Zavarella.
And that was like something you wanted to go for right away?
Yes, yes. As many young law graduates do, I wanted to work for a judge for a period of time. I think that's a wonderful experience. You get to learn so much. So I did that, not for a long time. I was about approximately a year and a half.
Were there things that the judge imparted to you or that you just learned from
Oh,
him?
he was a wonderful man. You couldn't ask for a better boss than Paul Zavarella. Wonderful temperament. When the Allegheny County Bar Association does their rating of judges, I think they do it every 5 or 7 years, something like that, he was always on top. He was always rated very high.
Were there things that he tried to mentor to you about or imparted to you? Any words of wisdom, things of that sort?
Mostly in the area of judicial temperament, you know, and how to always be above the fray, to treat lawyers courteously and respectfully. You know, he did. And I also got a lot of that from my Uncle Bill, Judge William Cercone, too. He was very, very well liked. I never heard a negative word about Bill Cercone.
So how did you go from working for Judge Zavarella to the assistant DA position?
Yeah, I had heard that there were some vacancies, and I applied and was interviewed and was hired. I started off in the general trial unit, as new assistant DAs do. When you're in that unit, you go out to the areas and do preliminary hearings at magistrates' offices throughout the county. And then once I returned, again in general trial, you do misdemeanor cases, not the most serious cases. But eventually, after you earn your stripes, you may advance into a specialty unit, which I did. I went into the crimes persons unit. I will tell you this, I do believe that in that experience in the crimes persons unit, I probably had one of the most challenging tasks that any lawyer has ever had. I had to cross-examine Rocky Blyer before an Allegheny County jury we're talking 1980 when the Steelers were at the peak of their success. The background of that was one of Rocky Blyer's teammates was charged with some crimes, attempted rape and indecent assault, and I I prosecuted the case. I was assigned the case. And Rocky Bleier was called as a character witness for his teammate. And of course, he was a witness, and my job was to cross-examine him. And that wasn't the easiest thing to do with somebody as popular as Rocky Bleier.
Was there some community pressure that you felt in some way?
Not really. If there was, I didn't feel it. I just did my job, that's all.
And from there, you became a district judge.
Yes.
And that was in the Stowe, McKees Rocks?
Right, my
area.
hometown. Yes. I was in the DA's office for approximately 3 years. And by the way, that's where I met my wife, in the DA's office.
How did that come about?
She was a recent graduate from Penn State, and she was a paralegal working in the DA's office. And I spotted her and said, you know, this beautiful girl is somebody I'd like to get to know better. And I was reprimanded once or twice for hanging around her desk a little too much, tongue-in-cheek. But yeah, we started to date, and it blossomed into a marriage and 3 sons.
Was it assumed that you would move on from the DA's office? Was that, or?
Well, I was taking it step by step. You know, there were times when I felt that maybe I should have stayed a little longer in the DA's office because it was such fantastic experience. I mean, you can imagine, you're in a courtroom every day. Sometimes you're getting assigned cases that you're going to try, and you're interviewing your witnesses for the first time as you're walking to the judge's courtroom. So you really have to think on your feet. So as I said, it's fantastic experience. On the other hand, when opportunity knocks, you have to take it. So what happened was there was a vacancy in our local district justice's office. Sometimes they call them district magistrates. The person who served in that position had been elected to Common Pleas Court, which created the vacancy. And I just thought it was a great opportunity, so I decided to throw my hat into the ring.
You were 29 or 30 at the time. Is that right?
Younger, because I was 32 when I was elected to Common Pleas Court.
Okay.
So I served there for 4 years. So I was about 28. Yeah.
So was it natural to fall into the role of a judge? Did it feel comfortable and, you know, like a very natural progression?
Absolutely. With my background, having served, you know, as a law clerk and then as an assistant DA, so that was about all put together about 4 years, you know, in courtrooms, watching judges, coming from a family of judges. I thought I had the experience and the background to serve as a district justice for my community.
You would have been dealing with the community on kind of a street level as a district justice.
Absolutely. You know, in many ways, that's the most important court. Well, first of all, that is the court where the average person has the most contact. You know, there are many, many people that will never see inside a courtroom of a federal courthouse or even the county courthouse. But being in front of, in some capacity, whether suing a contractor for a shoddy job or fighting a parking ticket, you may very well end up in front of your local magistrate.
Well, from there you moved on to Common Pleas judge, and how did that come about? Was that simply you applied for it? And
well, again, when opportunity knocks, you know, we have to take advantage of it. I was in my 4th year as a district magistrate, and 8 vacancies came up on the Allegheny County Court of Common Pleas. 8 vacancies. And I knew that I would not see that maybe ever again in my lifetime. And that was due to 4 retirements and the legislature having created 4 new vacancies. And I just said to myself, this is the time. I was young, I knew that, but I thought that with my background as a magistrate and DA and having clerked that I was ready. And in the election, there were 28 lawyers filed for 8 vacancies. And I led the ticket. I came.
And you served in that position for 16 years?
Yes.
Are there cases that you can recall that are particularly memorable during that time or meaningful to you?
Yes, absolutely. I actually was called upon twice to decide the death penalty. You know, in Pennsylvania, there's 2 phases to a death penalty case. Of course, there's the trial, where there's the jury decides guilt or not guilty, and then if there's a guilty verdict, then the penalty phase. Well, in those 2 cases, the defendant waived their right to have a jury decide, leaving the judge to make that decision. And yes, I remember Judge Ridge, who was one of my colleagues, who was in the same position once, having to make that decision, saying that it was too much of a decision for one mortal man to make. And he insisted on a court en banc. That's when you have 3 judges make the decision. Well, I mean, I didn't take it to that extent. I made the decisions, but yeah, that's one that keeps you up at night.
Well, that must have been particularly significant for you in light of what you told me about your uncle and what he used to say.
Good point. Except that I have always understood my role. And my role is a judge, not a legislator. If I were a legislator, I might vote for an amendment to abolish the death penalty, but I was a judge. And in Pennsylvania, after the Furman decision from the Supreme Court, where we had aggravating and mitigating factors to consider, my job was pretty clear-cut. I was to determine were there aggravating factors, were there mitigating factors, and to balance them against one another and come to a decision that was based upon the law.
Are there things that the public does or doesn't understand about the death penalty and about the process you just explained?
I don't know that the general population understands the details of it, as far as that there are factors that the decision maker has to address, and that it's not a decision that is, you know, just arbitrarily made. I don't know if they understand this concept that I was just talking about with the aggravating and mitigating factors, and how application of that statute works.
In 1993, you became an administration judge with the Supreme Court, and there were a couple of areas, from what I read, that you particularly had dealings with, and you may or may not want to comment on them. One of them was jail overcrowding. Speak about that if you can.
Yeah, well, we were having a serious problem with jail overcrowding. I don't want to take a lot of credit for that program, though, because it was really started by Judge Dower. I expanded on it, and what the program did was it was called the PDQ program. It stood for Plea Disposition Quickie. And basically what it was that cases were identified by the district attorney's office that appeared to be very amenable to plea agreements. And plea agreements were quickly devised and presented to the defense, and the case, after a plea agreement had been reached, was accelerated and brought before a judge in a mass hearing. I'm talking about, I'm going back now almost 20 years, but I think some of those proceedings involved as many as 50 defendants at one time, and they would enter their guilty plea. And of course, that would, people that were in jail, perhaps because they couldn't make bail. Sometimes bail was only $500 or $200, but they couldn't make it. And it got those people out of jail, on probation, and moving on.
And you were involved with a drug offender rehabilitation program.
Or drug court.
Drug court, right. Talk about the
yeah, we
genesis
did.
of that.
Yes, during my tenure as administrative judge, we did establish the first drug court in Western Pennsylvania. I had read about it in other states and found it to be very interesting. So I called a meeting with representatives from the Public Defender's Office and from the Allegheny County District Attorney's Office to put this drug court program together. The main concept there is to have one judge serve as the drug court judge and to work very closely with the defendant, monitoring his progress, his rehabilitation, and the like. And it's been a very successful program from what I understand.
Okay. Well, talk about how you came to be nominated and confirmed as a district judge. What was the process like for that, as you recall it?
Slow.
Were you surprised that your name came up?
Well, I always felt that I would like to make one additional change in my career. At this time I was the administrative judge. And for a judge at that point, there are two ways to go. You either run for a state appellate office or you apply for a federal vacancy. And I considered both. But as far as running for a state office, and I did consider that seriously, there were two things that held me back. One was I wasn't so sure that I would enjoy doing appellate work. I like being a trial judge. I like the interaction with jurors and lawyers, although you have some contact when you're an appellate judge with lawyers, but not on the same level as you do as a trial judge. And with witnesses. I'm a people person, and I was very concerned that being in an ivory tower of the appellate court, it might not be something I would like. The other was the fundraising issue connected with a statewide race. To me, the idea of having to go to lawyers who are going to be practicing in front of you and friends and asking for contributions was something that was very, very disturbing to me, something that I just really didn't want to do. And I was told very frankly that if you have any hopes of getting support for a statewide office, that you had to raise, and we're talking a lot of money at this time. I think when my Uncle Bill ran for the Superior Court, he told me he raised $50,000. You could multiply that by 10 or more at this point, and that turned me off right there. So that left the federal judiciary, and I thought it would be a great honor. I thought that perhaps after having been 16 years in common pleas court, I could perhaps contribute more on this level. And I learned again, opportunity knocks. There were a number of vacancies. I think there were 4 vacancies here. So that's when I thought this would be the time in my career to make the application. I was actually nominated by two presidents.
I wondered about that.
I was nominated first by President Clinton, but it was the year 2000. What do we know about 2000? That's an election year. I was actually nominated in the summer. But you know what happens to judicial nominations in an election year as you grow close to the election. The process slows down, or at some point it just stops. And that's what happened. And then after the election, President George W. Bush was elected, and again he had to fill 4 vacancies, and I was very fortunate to be one of the 4.
Have you enjoyed this job as much as the earlier ones?
Absolutely. As I'm asked that question from time to time, and my answer always is, I wouldn't go back. Yeah, it's different. There were different challenges, different areas of the law that I never did work in as a common pleas court judge, but there's a lot about the federal bench that's just wonderful. I mean, I think the caliber of lawyers is outstanding. I think the quality of their work is good. And I'm not faulting state practitioners. Their volume of cases is greater. They have a lot more, the numbers are so high. In state court, I know this as an administrative judge, we had 18,000 criminal cases filed in Allegheny County each year when I was serving there. Here, as far as the number of indictments for the entire Western District of Pennsylvania, it's under 1,000. So the numbers are just so much greater there. So my point is that the work product that you get down there just isn't the same as we get here in federal court.
Did you feel a greater sense of responsibility right away, and did that impact just the way you'd carry out your day?
I learned from Uncle Mike, Justice Mismano, that every case is important. It's important to the litigants, it's important to everyone connected with it. So in my mind, I cannot honestly say that when I became a federal judge, I thought, well, these cases are more important. I think every case I ever handled, I looked at from the same perspective.
To the degree that you can, what cases have stood out to you? Is there anything about your time on the federal bench, as far as that goes, that you'd care to say? Maybe in broad areas as opposed to specific cases.
Again, I want to return to that notion that I look at all my cases in the same way. And I don't care if it is an employment case, because to that aggrieved employee who's battling a big corporate employer, or whether we're talking about a mass class action, they all get my same attention.
And is there an emotional factor in any particular area of the law that you deal with that?
Many people have said to me, but when with your wife being a judge and you're a judge, you must talk about the law all the time around the dining room table or the kitchen table. And surprisingly, the answer to that is no. When I leave the courthouse for the day, I leave my work behind me. Except for those death penalty cases that I mentioned before, sure, there's something that you're going to toss and turn over. But other than that, I cannot really say that emotionally I get too involved with my cases. When I do my best, I try to be as thorough as I can, and I try in the end to get it right.
Are there any humorous moments in your years on the bench, either in the federal level or earlier, that come to mind? Things that happened in your courtroom that were funny?
I think of one. It's a little risque, I guess, but I just remember once in a personal injury case when an elderly man was on the witness stand talking about his right to a loss of consortium claim. His wife was injured in a car accident, and he went into a little bit of detail about how his sex life had changed. And I just remember having to turn my chair around to stare at the back wall to keep from laughing, to hear this 80-year-old man talk about how his sex life had now changed as a result of his wife's injuries.
Was he looking for some sort of monetary compensation?
Sure, that's what loss of consortium is.
Yeah, how do you evaluate?
Well, that
like
went to that was for the jury to decide.
On a professional level, looking back on your judicial experience, are there people that really stand out to you either that have worked in your office or that you've encountered in the courtroom and in other contexts?
Well, I think of the old saying, absence makes the heart grow fonder. I really do miss some of the judges that I worked with when I first went on the bench that are no longer working here. They were just fantastic individuals, and I really miss them. And I'm talking about men such as Gustav Diamond and Judge Don Ziegler, Don Lee, Judge Cohill, Judge Standish. They were giants to me. And when I first went on the federal bench, I didn't hesitate to call them for advice. Judge Weiss, who this building is named after, I think everybody misses him a great deal. He was just such an extraordinary person.
Are there certain lessons that they embodied in their conduct that stand out to you?
Mostly in the area of temperament. I would think that's what I think we learn most by listening and watching them, and I think in knowing how to handle lawyers who misstep, or defendants who are contumacious. I think in that area I learned the most from them.
Of course, that's not always true in terms of having an even temperament. There are certainly many cases of judges blowing up at people in the courtroom and vice versa. I mean, is that hard to avoid in your experience? Is keeping that temperament difficult?
I have here a book containing opinions from my uncle, Justice Mismano, and I keep this on my desk. And this was an excerpt from one of his opinions, and it says, "Why a judge sits high." And just let me read just very briefly from this. This is Mismano. "Judges sit on a higher level than any other participants in a courtroom contest because it is assumed that by training, study, and temperament, they are above petty anger and trivial irritations. But when a judge scolds a lawyer or a witness without reason, he falls from the plateau of respect and becomes a wrangler in the public square." So I try to keep that in mind.
Talk about your experiences as a teacher. That started relatively early in your career?
It did. And what's interesting is that I teach undergraduates. Most judges who teach in law schools.
And which university was this?
At Pitt.
Okay.
At Pitt. And I teach in the program called Administration of Justice / Legal Studies. And I teach criminal procedure and substantive criminal law. And these are students that many of whom go on to law school, or they go on to work as probation officers, police officers, somewhere else in the judicial system. But I find them so inquisitive, and they just love hearing some of my stories, emanating from the courtroom. And I've always said to myself, once it becomes work, once it becomes drudgery, I would quit. And I have no desire to stop. My wife says these are my 2 nights a week out. But I enjoy it very much.
Do you have a judicial hero of the past, I might ask?
A judicial hero of the past. Of course, Holmes, because he was the great dissenter. He was ahead of his time in so many areas, and he could write so convincingly. And, in the modern era, I don't mean to be just jumping on a bandwagon because she's so popular right now, but, Justice Ginsburg's story is just so fascinating. But I don't think I'm jumping on the bandwagon because when I was interviewed by the Allegheny County Bar Association for a rating for this job, they asked me that question, and that was 20 years ago, and I pointed to Justice Ginsburg. That how many people in their career have affected the lives of others as she has. I'm talking about, of course, with the women's movement and the role she played.
Not many judges get movies made about them.
No, they don't. That's
Or
correct.
celebrated like that, yes.
That's correct. But now some judges actually write screenplays that become movies, and of course I'm talking about Uncle Mike. Uncle Mike in the 1930s wrote a book that was later made into a movie called Black Fury, which was about the infamous coal and iron police in Pennsylvania.
I've been writing about them, yes.
Okay, well, he was a young legislator and introduced legislation that basically outlawed them in Pennsylvania. And to gain support for his legislation, he wrote this story that was picked up by Warner Brothers. And it was actually starring and directed by the top Hollywood people of that era. And I'm talking about Paul Muni, a multi-Academy Award winner. Many people don't know who he was because he was so long ago. And Michael Curtiz, who was the...
Casablanca. Tell me about your love of playing classical piano. I mean, you spoke earlier about how you talk with your music teacher about whether that should be a career or not, but that's been a love that's been constant since then?
My grandmother had an old upright piano, and I think I must have been 4 or 5 when I touched those keys, and I fell in love with the sound of a piano at a very young age. And I really have to give so much credit to my parents because they really sacrificed so that I could study music. As I told you, I studied with Carmen Rumo, who was, and I started when I was in 4th grade, and I studied with him all the way through high school. And he was one of the top teachers, and he was costly, and it was a sacrifice for my parents. But I stuck with it, and it's something I still have, and hopefully will have the rest of my life.
Do you have a piece that's a favorite of yours to play?
Whatever I'm playing at the time.
Is it strictly classical?
No. Oh, no. I like classical music. You know, I've just been working on some, and I'm teaching, I'm working myself. I'm not taking lessons, but I just polished off Claire de Lune and a Mozart. It's actually a concerto, but of course concerto is with the symphony behind you. Of course, I'm just doing the piano part. But no, I like show tunes a lot, movie themes. I never got into jazz. I never. That's a different area altogether. I never did pick up jazz.
Is music and the law in totally different spheres for you, or is there some commonality between the two?
Only to the extent that I hope it's true that they say that studying music keeps your mind sharp. I hope that's true, and that by my studying some of these, I'm forcing myself to study some of these difficult pieces. I'm working on a Scarabin etude. It's very, very difficult. Horowitz played it when he went to Moscow. I mean, hey, when I play, you probably couldn't even recognize it being the same. But it's forcing me to concentrate, just like doing crossword puzzles. They say exercises the mind. So you know, I hope it does that.
Looking back over your career, what would you like your legacy as a judge to be? How would you like what you've done to be thought of?
When judges impose sentence, we have to consult a statute, Title 18, Section 3553. And that's a law that Congress passed that enumerates all of the factors that judges must consider when imposing sentence. And conspicuously absent from that list is mercy. But I incorporate mercy in all of my sentences when appropriate. I believe that, as the Bible says, you should temper justice with mercy. Even Lincoln said that he felt that the decisions that he made that bore, what were his words, that bore the most fruit were those where he applied mercy, something to that nature. So I would like to be remembered as a judge that was fair and that, when appropriate, didn't forget about mercy.